introduce our panel. My name is Charlotte Rubaum. I work for Stiftung Mercator, which is a German foundation. We have a Swiss sister foundation. We had a colleague sitting on the panel this morning, but I'm from the German branch, let's say, and we work on climate change, climate action beyond other topics. A few introductory words to the topic of our panel this afternoon. I think it's clear that climate change poses a great challenge for democracy. If we do not reduce greenhouse gas emissions drastically, the impact on our societies and our economic systems will be severe. We will see growing income gaps. We will see growing impacts on weak socioeconomic groups in all countries. Of course, there are global differences, but the impact will be severe. But apparently, democracies also failed to address the climate challenge so far. Climate change is what some scholars call a wicked problem, so with complex causes and no simple solutions, and a multitude of interests involved, and that makes it very complicated. And this complexity in time and space also seems to overwhelm the governing capacity of democracy. So this might lead some actors to questioning democracy's capacity to deal with climate change, but this question does probably not lead us anywhere. I think we are all well aware of the advantages of our democratic systems in fighting the climate crisis and the possibilities they offer to push for climate action. We know that in open and democratic societies, we have access to information, we can easily spread information, we can organize and form associations, we can protest, we can express our opinions and concerns, and we can hold unwilling governments accountable if they do not act. And of course, also people can use their creativity to find solutions to this tremendous challenge. So the question is actually, do we manage or do we make the best possible use of those multiple opportunities we have and make the best possible use of the advantages of our democratic system? And what does that mean, making the best possible use? And secondly, we also need to ask, how can we make sure that we preserve the opportunities democracies offer to address the climate crisis? Because we all know democracies are under threat in many places in this world, and they are under pressure to act quickly in face of climate change. And how can then decisions be made swiftly under the pressure of advancing climate action without losing democratic quality and without losing or without governing over the heads of citizens? So those are the challenges we are facing, and they are not easy, as you might see as well. And I have to admit that my perspective on the topic is quite Eurocentric, working for a German foundation, mainly on national and European level. And so I'm very glad our panelists here today come from Europe, but also from the US and from South America, Brazil. And I will now introduce our three panelists. We first have Amanda Zurores. She is a graduate student in psychology at the Federal University of Pernambuco in Brazil, where she works also with the Brazilian community at Climate Science, an organization which aims to make learning on climate engaging, accessible, and reliable. And you're also generally an advocate for climate education and climate justice in your country and your community. And in this role, you also have quite some experience, I understood, in working with local communities in your country to open spaces for climate education in different environments and to reach people within their daily neighborhoods. And you were also involved in the Global Citizens Assembly, which is a very exciting experience, and I think you can maybe tell us a little bit more about that later on. And you also fought for a climate assembly in your own town. So you have the global and the local experience, which is very interesting, I think. Then we have on my left as well Sarah Edward. She is head of research and engagement at the Center for New democratic processes in Minnesota in the US. And the center is partnering with citizens, communities, and institutions to design and implement informed and democratic processes. So you're on the design side, but also on the practical implementation side. The center is also one of the, as I understood, one of the players in the US who pioneered the use of citizens' juries. And currently you also run projects around climate and community resilience to create shared visions or community-based responses to climate change and extreme weather events. So very interesting perspective here as well. You're an historian by training, and so you can probably tell us a bit about the history of why we speak about democratic engagement on climate as well. And you draw on several years of experience as a facilitator and scholar as well. And yeah, today you oversee the design and implementation of the center's engagement work, as well as the research activities. So we have two very interesting perspectives on my right-hand side, and we have a European perspective here on my left-hand side, and a European perspective here on my right-hand side. Erwin Meyer, he's from Democracy International. You're sitting on the board of Democracy International, but you're also here representing Mehr Demokratie Austria, which is an organization fighting in Austria for direct and participatory democracy. Which is a partner organization of Democracy International, and you're a co-founder of Democracy Austria. You were also, which is a very interesting perspective for our panel here, you were also energy campaigner at Greenpeace Austria, former before that, and you worked as an independent energy consultant in the field of climate and energy. And you're an environmental economist by training, so bring in your expertise here as well. So that's our panel, and I'm very much looking forward to the debate. We will start with the debate here on the panel, but please be prepared that I will also include you in the debate later on. So you're very welcome to already think about questions you might have to our audience, but also about own perspectives you have, which you want to bring in into the discussion. So in the last half hour or so, I will get back to you, and in the spirit of a democratic debate, also try to integrate your perspectives as best as possible. So my first question to our audience, to our panel, is that at least from what we can observe in Europe, or what I can observe in Europe, we currently see a very strong dynamic in the experimentation with participatory forms of democratic engagement in the climate debate. There's a strong tendency towards democratic innovations, new forms of democratic participatory instruments, such as citizens' assemblies or citizens' juries. And the climate change movement seems to play an important role in demanding more democratic innovations and more direct and deliberative forms of participation. But also the democracy movement has identified climate as an important topic. So can you confirm this observation also in the geographic context you work in? Or do you rather see governments closing off climate-related debates or decisions from open democratic space, arguing with the need to speed up the transition? And what are the reasons for this development? So that's, I think, the most interesting question to kick off the debate. Do you confirm this observation? But also, what are the reasons? Why do we see this call for more democratic innovation, specifically in the climate change debate? I will start with you, Sarah, to have your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, I think we can probably all agree and confirm. I think your observation is spot on. There has been over the last, I would say, 3 to 4 years specifically, momentum around assemblies and climate in European contexts. And obviously those look different if they're national initiatives or if they're regional initiatives, or even, I would say, kind of hyper-local initiatives that could be in towns or cities or even villages. We've seen those as well. I think that there was a lot of initial interest, at least from my perspective as a practitioner, among self-identified climate activists. who saw these as a way to reach electeds or their representatives, and to say, look, this is a mini public. These are the people. Here will be their recommendations. The public is wise. They're going to say we need to be very expedient around climate change, and so assemblies or juries, I think, were an appealing method and are still an appealing method among activists. And I think, speaking from someone in the field, we started to see these calls of let's do more of these events and invest resources into thinking about kind of how we design these processes in a way that brings in activist voices and perspectives, but then also people who maybe don't necessarily see themselves as stakeholders when it comes to climate change. And we can talk more about that later, because I think in an earlier panel today, the concept of stakeholders came up, and I think we should talk about that more, because when you think about climate, or really any topic, shouldn't we all be stakeholders? And it's really a matter of getting people into a place where they see what that stake might be. And it might not be traditionally a way that they saw themselves within a problem, but I think activists particularly see that if we can show people through assemblies why climate change is important to think about and to act on, then we will broaden our stakeholder base. So I think that's why some of the momentum has really kind of been sustained over a number of years.
Okay, so raising awareness for the topic and increase the stakeholder base. I would be very interested in your definition of stakeholders. How broad would that be? What kind of stakeholders are you thinking of when you?
Well, I think a lot of times when we do civic participation work, or civil servants talk about stakeholders, and a lot of times that is a person who is interpolated into a problem of, oh, this directly affects me, and so I'm a stakeholder and I'm going to be mobilized and do some of this kind of participatory democracy work, and that will often transfer to voting. But I think a lot of times, and not just our work around climate, but other topics, the beauty of a project is when it activates someone to see themselves as a stakeholder when they didn't see themselves as a stakeholder before. So they see that this topic affects their lives, or they see how they want to be involved in this topic. So I think climate is a very appealing topic to activists.
Well, perfect leading over to Amanda. So you said people see themselves as stakeholders, even if they didn't know they were stakeholders before, perhaps. Is that something you can observe as well in your communities you work with?
Yes. Actually, we work for people to see themselves as stakeholders, because sometimes we don't understand that people doesn't have access to information, to responsible information, civic information, and climate education, for them to understand what's happening in their own context, to understand what is happening to them. So that's pretty much what we do as a climate activist, as someone who's, there's this great thinker from Brazil that says that there is an antidote that preserves and sustains democracy. And I say, I'm not a democracy specialist, but I work with it, which is education. And to be more specific, I work with climate education for people to understand they are part of it. They're not only victims of the impacts that are happening, because when we say they're passive victims, we make it harder for them to understand themselves as part of the solution, but for them to have a right to their own future, to say what they want for the future. So I believe that's what our work is all about, empowering people through education. But we're talking about different contexts, of course. So there's a professor of mine that said to me that sometimes people don't always see themselves as a subject of rights. So sometimes they don't even recognize themselves as someone who have rights. And I want to talk a little bit more about the reason why I think this is a momentum for the democracy to work with the climate agenda. We've been talking about justice, and that's very important. And we're talking about an emergency. So when it comes to climate emergency, we're dealing with the impact of it from now. So it's an emergency scenario, and is a scenario that there's no universal experience of it. So people suffer the impact of it in a different way. And I brought some numbers because I can speak from a local perspective. in Recife, which is the town I live. It is in the northeast part of Brazil. This year we went through extreme weather, and in 24 hours we lost 132 people. And not only we lost those lives, but thousands of people had to move from their homes because of it. And again, we're talking about an emergency. I had data from 2018, which means 4 years ago, where 1 million people suffered from the impacts of extreme rains and floods in Brazil, but 43 million people suffered from droughts in Brazil, and 90% of them were from the Northeast, which is where I come from. So we're not talking about a fair problem, we're not talking about a just problem. We're talking about reaching climate justice, reaching climate solutions, and that means we have to count on people, and that's where democracy comes from. Once I heard that a politic practice that is only focused on specialists and professionals, it's not fair if it doesn't focus on people, if it doesn't have people working on that. So we're talking about democracy, which is giving people the power, which has its course on guaranteeing people's right, and democracy seems to be the fair way to talk about climate crisis, because we're talking about injustice, we're talking about justice, we're talking about now. So yeah, that's pretty much why I think now we have this tendency to see more democratic tools in those spaces to talk about climate reality. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. That resonates with our audience. That's good to know. Yeah, thank you for this perspective. You raised a very important keyword, which we will get to back later, which is the justice question, and how can we deal with this very complicated question of climate justice when it comes to democratic participation. We will definitely get back to that. But turning to you, Erwin, my initial question was, why do we speak about more citizens' participation in climate policy? And what are the reasons we see so many actors demanding for it? We have heard several perspectives already, justice, including different stakeholders. What's your take on it?
Thanks for the introduction. The only thing I want to add is I'm not just speaking for the European perspective. As Democracy International, of course, we have a global perspective. And I made a survey for the Austrian Climate Ministry, including a lot of US examples, for example, Washington State Climate Assembly and the referenda there, and also the deliberative opinion polls of James S. Fishkin, etc., etc. So I want to say that we really should have a global perspective. But coming to your question, it was a very good question. Why do we have this deliberative wave, as the OECD is calling these hundreds of citizens' assemblies around the world, and many of them dealing with climate and energy topics? At least to my mind, we have two reasons for that. First is a bottom-up grassroots movement of people who say, we want to have a say in climate policies, and we trust ordinary people, and we want to engage them, and therefore we are asking for climate assemblies. For example, XR is having as a third demand, and some other NGOs. But as long as it would only be a demand by the NGOs, to be honest, there wouldn't be climate assemblies, because they need a lot of money. We are talking about 1 million, 2 million, France, 5 million, whatever, millions of euros. So it can only be financed in this system if big companies or normally governments and officials give some money. And then you have to look at the interests from the other side, from above, top down. What are the interests of politicians to make deliberative processes and climate assemblies? As we had heard in the morning session, it's very often getting out of jail. It's putting a lid on the top on the process. It's about moderating. It's about getting out the pressure. It's about avoiding hard conflicts in the public sphere and bringing people in hidden rooms where they can discuss how long they like to. So that means there is a good reason for it and there's a bad reason for it. And both are responsible that we have this huge deliberative wave. And it's our task to bring it on a good way, to combine these instruments of climate assemblies with direct democracy and to bring it into the hand of the people. It should be for the people, by the people, as we heard already. And this is not done until now. Now the rules, the money and everything is designed by governments and their officials. And civil society has a very limited influence on the design of this process, on the link to the politics, how the recommendations are taken up or not, and this we have to change.
So there seems to be a tension between, on the one hand, the climate activists asking for assemblies because they accept them to increase the political pressure to act. On then the other side, you mentioned there the politicians who say, well, climate assemblies are a good idea because maybe it takes out the pressure.
In France, it was the perfect example for that.
So that's kind of a contradiction. How do you see that, Sarah?
I'll say it makes our job really difficult, right? Because essentially you're building a process, as you both know, from the ground up, and you have to really be simultaneously on the defensive and the offensive, because you need an independent process, and you simultaneously have to earn the trust of all of your partners, okay? So that's not just the convening bodies and the people who are paying you to do this work. That is different local organizations, different institutions that you're working with. If you bring in corporate partners or corporate speakers, then you're moving into the cultural dynamics of this space. So if you're in a local context, there are histories there that you're walking into as a practitioner who's trying to create this process. So you're simultaneously trying to build trust amongst groups that are already at odds. And so I'll say it's very, very difficult. And it's a constant balance to try to shepherd the participants through that process and actually safeguard it so they can do their work, right? And simultaneously have outputs from the participants that are not only thoughtful, but they're durable, so they actually can go where they need to go, and that might be at a local level or to decision makers in terms of what policies or recommendations come out. But then I would also say that they need to be realistic. This analogy of let's do more assemblies, as a practitioner, I don't want to say like, no, let's not have more democracy, but sometimes that can backfire. If you do a process where you earn the public's trust and you sit them in a room and they feel great and they go on camera and they say, my perspective was heard and this was great, and then the recommendations don't go anywhere, I have to look them in the eye. I earned their trust and I failed them. So I think it's really, really difficult. And you also need to make sure that in the room together that you set the parameters of a process so that it's realistic. When we were kids, we would always have elections in our schools, and the pitch every single year was one student would inevitably say, okay, if you give me your vote, Pizza Fridays. So it's like, you can't have an assembly where it's like, we want Pizza Fridays, we want Taco Tuesdays. That's great, but what are you willing to give up to get there? And I think climate especially is something we have to really dig into about what we're willing to give up. And it's not just about what we're willing to give up next week, what we're willing to give up 10 years from now to ensure that our quality of life is decent. Yeah. And
Let's try to be a bit more concrete even. What are the crucial questions where you think that politicians need input from not only citizens' assemblies, but maybe also other forms of deliberative democracy or other forms of citizens' input? What are those crucial questions? You mentioned justice, so maybe you can elaborate a little bit more on that. But both of you as well, Sarah and Erwin, what do you think are the key questions where governments are but they also think themselves maybe they need this input, because it's not only civil society pushing. We were discussing that in the morning panel, I think. It's not only civil society pushing governments to do citizens' assemblies, and then in the end governments say, okay, yeah, let's do it. Maybe it takes out some pressure, but it's also a tool with which politicians or the institutions of our representative democracy can use to move forward and to really develop good solutions. So what are those crucial questions in the climate debate? But maybe you want to start, Amanda, and elaborate a little bit more on the question of justice and how it can be involved in those participatory instruments.
Sure. When we're talking about climate justice, we like to say that nothing about us without us. But I think there's something that is very interesting. I was learning a little bit more about human-centered design and how they say that the ones who suffer from a problem are the ones who better collaborate on a solution. But sometimes we have to go a step back and understand what are the real problems. So I think the first part and the first step has to go to the people to understand what is a real question, what is a real problem, and how can we fix it. So I think when it comes to justice, we have to talk to the ones who are in the front line of the problem, to talk about energy transition, to talk on how to make everything a little bit more fair when it comes to climate. I have some things, as I said before, whenever we put the people in this narrative of passive victims, we're weakening their perspectives on becoming leaders and active leaders. So we gotta go for them to understand a little bit more what are the problems, but also understand them as part of the solutions. So I participated in Global Assembly, for example, and we went on different topics like education. So where do they want to see education? Because it's not reaching everyone. It's not. At least I can say from my context, it's very hard. We don't see climate education in schools, which are the learning spaces we have. But we don't see it on the neighborhood. We don't see it anywhere. Even though we talk about different contexts, privileged ones and vulnerable ones, so they can talk about it. So I would say nothing about us without us. And I have this great example. When it comes to women, 70% of the ones who are in extreme poverty are women. But if we want to talk about a solution to climate change, then if women had the access to the same resources as men that are producers in their farms have, the produce would increase to 20 and 30%, for example. And that would be a sustainable producing. And some data brings that the greenhouse gases emissions will lower. So we're talking about the ones who are suffering from the problem, but the ones who have a better solution as well. So yeah, I think there are lots of questions when it comes to justice that everyone should be involved, and especially the ones who are in the front line of it.
Finding solutions to the climate crisis is also about conflicts, and justice questions are often, or at the source of justice questions, we often have also, or as a result, we see conflicts in the end. So, Sarah, maybe how from the experiences you had on the ground when you also did with local communities, you worked in citizens' juries around the question of extreme weather events. What kind of conflicts did you see there, and how far did the citizens' juries help to deal with those conflicts?
I think actually in Irvin, I want to come back to you because I think it would be great to get your perspective on some of these politicians' questions, especially having experience with energy. So, in some cases, an apprehension for people to join in to this process surfaced even before we brought people in a room. And so we had city officials say, okay, yeah, sure, this seems great, but really, I just need people to stop calling me about the swimming pool. So, I don't know why you want me to come and speak, because if you can get people to stop, literally about the swimming pool, no physical pun intended, but if you can get people to stop calling me about that, great, I'll show up, I'll give you an hour of my time. that was somebody not seeing themselves in the problem, but it wasn't necessarily a disagreement. Now we have participants who at the end of a process would say, I thought climate change was a hoax. I mean, we have a guy on camera who really says this. He said he was a big fan of Rush Limbaugh's, who's a conservative pundit, and he didn't believe in climate change until going through the process. Now, there was a type of vulnerability that he needed to even come into a room with people he probably disagreed with, but I think some of it goes back to this initial framing and how you invite people in. So we didn't say come to a process about justice and climate. We didn't say that. We said we're organizing a process about extreme weather in your area. And so that looked different, and that's a different invitation for people to come to a space together. And so when they're talking about, well, our big industry locally is fishing in the summer and snowmobiling in the winter, but our seasons are changing. That's actually going to affect our local economy more. Or energy transitions, we're seeing wind energy pop up, but we don't like what it looks like. And so what do we want our energy future to be? That's where you start to get some of those conflicts on a local level, both in that room and then also with elected officials or city officials. So, but Irvin, you probably have other perspectives too.
Yeah, I want to come back on this climate justice question you said. There are more elements in it. First of all, of course, it is about burden sharing and distribution of money, etc. As I said, this survey on the climate assemblies in the world, in the US and globally in Europe, etc., there's a clear outcome. The recommendations are socially fair. So if you make randomly selected citizens' assemblies, people take care about the least wealth persons and the handicapped persons and etc., etc. So this is not a, I would say, capitalistic outcome. It's a very for the good outcome for the good common living. The second thing is, if you do climate policies in the normal way, what is normal? Normal means in the indirect democracy, and I call really it indirect democracy because they themselves call them representative democracy, but they are not representative. If they would be representative, we wouldn't have those problems. They are just indirect democracy. And what is indirect democracy is about, you are electing some few persons and they have all the decision power. It's a concentration of power, and this is perfectly made for interventions for special interest groups and for lobbying. I was working as a lobbyist by myself for many years, on the good side, for renewable energy. But I know the system and how it works to get into the policy cycle and to get the outcome you need and you are paid for. I know this. And the more concentration of power you have, the less representative is the system, but the better it is for fossil fuel interests and the old business models, fossil-based business models. So this means social justice needs more involvement of the people and needs final decision-making. And maybe only one anecdote, it's not a proof, but it's again of France. You know this Yellow West protests in France, because Macron did not only make a CO2 tax reform. Everyone is talking on the CO2 tax reform, but this was not the core of this change. He made a lot of other changes, favoring big capital, favoring people living in towns, etc. So at the end, it was not social justice. It favored the rich and it favored the people in towns. And of course, the people living on the land and the people less wealth than the others went out and protested in the Yellow West movement. And then he said, if he would made the climate assembly before, and if he would have read the recommendations before, he would have changed the whole financial reform in France. So, of course, normally, indirect political systems favor lobbyists that have privileged access to the decision makers. And this is definitely against social justice and climate justice. So if we want to bring it in, we need climate assemblies, but again, combine it either with being implemented in the constitution so that the lottery system is deciding on policies, or you make a second step, bring it to referendum and these are deciding.
Okay, there are many aspects in that we can follow up on, but thank you. They are perfect to bring forward our discussion, I think. First of all, my question would be, if you combine those deliberative formats based on petition, for example, I think in your example it's mainly citizen assemblies, if you combine them with direct democracy, or if you give them the power to decide, do you think that's also possible if it comes to more sensitive measures in the climate debate, such as changes to the prevailing economic models, close down sectors of economic activity, measures affecting citizens' lifestyles, which are the crucial questions which come up if you really want to change the system. Do you think that's something which can be decided by citizens' assemblies or in referenda? Or how does this then interact with the decision power of governments?
Because very good question, and I want to answer it very radical. I would say the more decisive the questions are, and the more important, and the more money is involved, and the more consequences are felt, the more it needs direct democracy and citizens' assembly and deliberation. That means I don't like the distinction between, I call it adult climate policies, making the big discussions and big decisions made by the people in the EU Parliament, in the Commission, etc. And then there are some small amounts, I call it children climate policies, some playgrounds erected for the people where you can say, okay, discuss a little bit of circular economy and plastic bags, etc. You can talk about that. And we will say we make deliberative budgetary processes. 1% of the public expenditures can be decided by you, but the big questions are decided by us. No, the other way around. The small questions could be decided by the government and by the parliament, and all the big questions should be decided by the people. And what is a big question, even in the climate topic, has to be decided by the people themselves.
Just well, we got some approval from our audience. It would be great if we have perspectives on that from the audience later on. I will get back to you in about 15 minutes, 20 minutes. So think about that, because I think that's a crucial question. I'm sure also from the feedback you gave, there are perspectives in the audience on this question. But even if you don't agree with Erwin, please feel free to raise that. Sarah, how do you think could the best features of expert-led democracy, because that's also what you were talking about. We have stakeholder consultations, we have governments consulting with experts, with organized civil society, with science. They have their expert advisory boards, for example. How can the best features of that be combined with the best of participatory democracy?
I would say in some ways it is. If you do a thoughtful process, I should note, they're not fast. And I think that is, it's a benefit, and it's also a trade-off that you make when you run these, because you do need to make really difficult decisions, I would say, because you don't have an infinite amount of time, obviously, if we're talking about climate. Nor resources, and that can be financial resources, or that can just be the public's buy-in to attend to this. People are busy. Sylvia mentioned earlier, having somebody do public feedback for these consultation processes over and over again. Not everybody actually has that time or energy, and so when you bring people together, you need to make sure that you have a diverse set of perspectives. You've framed the remit, the participants' remit really clearly, so you're asking them to do a finite task. You're not giving them the world and saying, what's this huge menu of things that you want, right? Because then that does go back to, there's a bunch of money on the table, a decision needs to be made, and we need to act on this. And so whatever decision that is, you need to put in that work beforehand to get the buy-in. And then when that process is done, it holds up to public scrutiny, right? That it's not something that was put out there with a clear agenda to do X, Y, and Z. I think about our processes, which are a lot smaller, so maybe they would be some of the children's money work, but they are on a local level, and I would say the public is very intelligent as a whole, and whether they fall on a liberal side or a conservative side, people are skeptical, and they're right to be skeptical of public consultation processes because I think the public has been burned over and over again. And so you need to do that really careful work, too, of making sure that the process will hold up to scrutiny when it's done. And that sometimes means having people from across the political spectrum in that room, making sure that you have a broad perspective of experts, and you also bring in community participants to speak to their expertise as community members, because I think that's something that is really important, and these processes can do really well, right? You have people with their lived experience talking about how it's impacting them now.
Yeah. Amanda, you spoke a lot about bringing in the voices of the unheard, maybe also the voices of marginalized communities. In how far do you think this is, can that be guaranteed by expert-led democracy? Because there are, of course, also people who say, I'm expert on social justice, and I'm expert on communities because I work with them. But I'm not part of this community itself. So what's your experience in involving those people?
Well, I mean, there are lots of challenges when it comes to having people in those spaces. As I'm someone who works with education, there is the problem that we don't have, people that doesn't have access to understanding the problem, and we don't bring it closer to them. I think that's the key point, because we have to bring it closer to their reality. We have to, I don't know, maybe try to ask them what happens when it rains in their community, so they can understand a little bit more that, okay, it's raining more, and whenever it rains, someone dies. So I'm talking about climate justice, even though I don't know I'm talking about climate justice. So we're launching a program in Recife, which is the Time Leave, to get closer to people, to go to the neighbors, to understand a little bit more from them what's happening, and also get climate education for them to understand what's happening globally in more technical ways, what are happening with the climate. But I think there are also other challenges when it comes to, we know the core of democracy is guaranteeing basic rights. That's why what we fight for. But I was talking to someone before, and we have 33 million people in Brazil that are starving, that doesn't know if they're gonna eat. And how can I tell this person that she has the right to express, she has the right to deliberate, when a basic human right like food that is essential for her to live, it's not guaranteed? So how can I tell her that she can express herself, she can deliberate on something? It's very hard, because we're talking about multiple crises. We're talking about a crisis that intensifies other ones. And how can we bring it closer to the people? And there's other thing, as I said before, that people don't see themselves as a subject of right sometimes. And this make them abdicate from finding a solution, because they don't believe it's gonna happen. So it's very hard, because maybe what we were saying, to be more specific, to have the right questions, and to show the impact of the deliberation is very important, because they can see that it has a way. They should be thinking about solutions. Something is gonna happen. So I think it's it's a complex challenge with a lot of particularities, and we have to think of different things when it comes to that. Yeah, but I would say that there's no citizen participation that are responsible without responsible education. So starting with getting climate education and civic education everywhere is a way to motivate participation, and maybe bringing it closer to the people will get her closer to us.
Thank you. That may lead us to another aspect as well. We speak a lot about citizens' assemblies, participatory instruments. We speak about the role of organized civil society groups in expert-led democracies. But in the climate debate, we also see several local initiatives where people organize themselves around the sharing economy, where they set up new models of reorganizing their own neighborhoods, etc. And that as well has a democratic implication, I would say. And you were kind of alluding to that maybe, because I would say it's part of climate education probably. And through those local initiatives where people themselves, they decide to do social innovation, they might be more open to get part of the democratic debate, because then they discover, oh, it's not that easy to set up a bike sharing service in my community, because there are rules and laws which hinder me to do that, and maybe I should get involved in the local city council to change that, to phrase it very simply. So is that something which you can observe, that local engagement for social innovation in the communities you work with encourages people to become more political?
Definitely. There's also a study that was published in Nature that talks about these different initiatives that are from civil disobedience, that are nonviolent. And they studied that this kind of action and different social initiatives, they have an impact on raising awareness. And if we're talking about like raising awareness and education and as a first step for a democracy to work, so I think it has been proven that working directly with people, working as civil society has been collaborating to democracy, and as well is making us see that we cannot work alone. I was talking to this partner of mine in the climate activism, and she was talking about how the civil society and the ones in the neighbor had to work to get the people who were suffering from the impacts of the extreme weather and the rains. They were, I don't know how to say that, but Silvia, do you know soterrados? So their houses fell from the cliff, and they were there under the everything. So the neighborhood had to organize themselves to be there, to get them from everything, and to save the people, but that's not enough. So that's when we have to think that we can't act alone, and we have to advocate, and we have to come closer to municipality and different sectors, because sometimes we can't act all by ourselves. So I think it happens, it improves the awareness among the people, but it also shows us that we have to collaborate with different sectors, otherwise we're not going to reach the complexity of the problem.
Irvin, I see you making notes, but you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, very small comment. I like these local forms of engagement, raising engagement and improving it. I also doing a local citizens assembly in my hometown on land use. So this is interesting, but there's a but. As you said it in your question, yeah, does it lead to, I would say, climate policy Biedermeier? I don't know if this expression is known outside of Europe, but it means Michael Eman said he's a lot talking about individualism and bringing the people back to their private home and their gardening and their village, etc., but staying away from the big discussions and big climate policies on the global level. And local engagement could be the first step to do then the bigger things, to start with that. But of course, to be honest, as we said half an hour, 1 hour ago, there's a big interest of the policy to let the local initiatives and the local engagement there as it is, and keep the people away from the big policy decisions. For example, in Austria, we had a lot of support in Vienna for these social innovations, a lot of money for all those groups working on these levels. But the same persons, I don't say the name here, she was at the last global forum or one before, has been very strongly against direct democracy and very strongly against citizens' assemblies making final decisions. So again, some persons are very strongly supporting this grassroots movements and giving all the money they need, but being happy that they stay away from the big decisions. And maybe the last story on that, in Austria, the Fridays for Future blocked a big highway next to Vienna. And they have been blocking this building area for more than half a year, and a lot of media attention. It was a big conflict, a big political issue. And what did the state government of Vienna say to them? Get out of this building area, stop blocking, but take part in our participatory processes. We have a lot of rooms, a lot of moderation, a lot of money for you. Come on, get there in this room, make your proposals, and we will have a look at it. Of course, they have been intelligent enough not to follow this, and they have been going on with blocking this highway construction. So this is called a participatory trap. And it's always even hard for me to make a distinction between helping these processes, because you have to start on the local level, and at the same time being aware of this misuse of participatory elements.
I gotta say something. It's very hard sometimes because sometimes they want us to do their jobs. And that's very hard because it doesn't have to be people doing separate jobs. We have to collaborate, but we don't have to take accountability for things that are not civil society's responsible sometimes. So it's very hard to recognize these traps, these participatory traps, because sometimes we're invited as civil society to join something, but they just want us to do it for free. That happens all the time. So it's very hard for us to see how to collaborate. And sometimes we have to go there and say, okay, although we are working together, everyone has to do their part. So when there's an extreme weather event at a town, we need to have professionals there to help us. We need to save lives in a proper way. That's not our own. That's not like our job to be done. Of course we can do it because sometimes we have to do it. That's all we have. But we have to understand a little bit more and keep our eyes open to this kind of traps because it happens often. Yeah.
Yeah. We open the discussion in a few minutes. And yeah, we're here down to some very crucial questions.
Can I jump in really quick?
Yes, Sarah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So the first thing I want to say is I think these processes can do a good thing in terms of the individual, and that's making them aware of the commons, right? Inviting them in to see a connection amongst people who they previously thought about as strangers, and hopefully that can have a ripple effect. So I think that is a benefit, even when they think about, can I put a box fan in my house when we have fires? And can I check on my neighbor to make sure they have a fan filter as well, so their air quality is good. So I think that's an entry point for people to start seeing themselves as part of society, not just locally, but if I can think about my neighbor, I can think about somebody in the next town over, in the next state over when there are fires. So I think there's that activation bit. But I also think, and going back to what you said, if we think about assemblies when they fail, right? So if we might think about France, what does it mean to fail? Does it mean that all the recommendations weren't taken on board? Or can we see a win there too? Because now when you commission an assembly or a deliberative process, if that's a decision maker commissioning it and putting the resources in, if they say no or they turn down those recommendations, that's a tell. And they're showing themselves, right? And so the onus is actually on them to explain to the public why they're not doing that. So maybe we can subvert that a little bit and think about maybe there is a win there and maybe there's a crack and we can use that.
Well, the question beyond that is also what's the value of deliberation, even if it does not lead to yes or no or to a decision in the end. And I think what should be the aim is probably to have the decision makers or the politicians in power on board so that they use the deliberative process to take the best decisions themselves in the end. And if they need a decision from the citizens, then that might be an option for some questions as well. But sometimes the deliberative value of the process itself is also can be crucial. But of course, we should avoid this trap, which you mentioned. So it's not an easy task, neither for those actors asking for citizens' assemblies, nor for the political decision maker, I would say.